The title of our sermon today is, What's It Worth to You? And the question I'm asking is, what is following Jesus worth to you? Or another way I could ask it is, what will stop you from following Jesus? From the passage that we're going to look at today, I'd like to draw out 5 tests of commitment. What we'll see as we open up this passage together is that Jesus is talking with his disciples. And we saw just in the last chapter, in Mark 8:34, Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, let him what? Deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. He gave the cost of discipleship. Well, in our passage today, it's almost as if he's going to apply it. He's going to give illustrations and say, this is what it looks like. Here's the test. Are you really in it? Are you really willing to be a follower? What will stop the disciples from following Jesus? What is it worth to them? And I want us to ask the same questions of ourselves. What is following Jesus worth to me? What's it worth giving up in my life? Now, my desire absolutely is that as we go through these 5 questions, my hope, my desire is that every single person here would say, yes, it's worth it to all 5 of these questions. But I openly acknowledge that we're walking into this room this morning, we're listening this morning, coming from all different kinds of weeks and all different kinds of recent experiences and even all different kinds of lives, aren't we? We're bringing in all kinds of stuff into the hearing of this message. And so I recognize and understand that we're coming at this from different perspectives. And so let me say this. You may already be thinking, oh, this is the kind of message for young people, whatever young people is for you. And let me just say right now, it's not, because back in Mark 8:34, Jesus says, if anyone. This call to discipleship is for everyone. It doesn't matter if you're 85 or if you're 5. The invitation is for you. Jesus is not discriminatory by age or gender or race or anything else, okay? In this way. The invitation is open. But I also wanted to say this. If you've already been sensing by what God has been doing in your life recently, if you've already been sensing that God is calling you to take a deeper step of commitment, that God is calling you to a greater level of obedience, but you've been saying, but I don't know what that means. I don't know what my next step is. I don't know exactly what he's asking from me or of me. I'm excited for you, because I beg you to listen carefully this morning, because Jesus is going to lay out, this is what it looks like. This is what a follower of me will be acting like and thinking like. This is what their life is ordered around. And so this is for you. And so my hope is, as we dive in, if you come to any of these and you say, I'm not sure, Pastor Dave, I'm not sure if I can go there. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. What I hope happens is I hope you don't come to that test of the 5 and you say, okay, I'm out. I can't do that. No, if you come to one of these 5 and you say, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I can go there. Then my hope is you'll do this. Don't say, no, I'm out, and shut your ears off. No, instead, at that moment, then pray and ask God to help you. Because the reality is, for all of us, none of us can just do this on our own. None of us. In every single one of these, all 5, to be able to obey, that's actually God's grace in our lives. That's God at work saying, I'm going to help you with this. And so if you come to one of these 5 and you say, I'm not sure, that's the moment to pray and ask God to help you. Ask God to give you the strength. Ask God to do the changing. But not only that, and I'm being specific here, if you come to one of these 5 and you say, I'm just not sure I can go there, here's the prayer that I'd like you to pray. I'd like you to pray, God, would you help me to see the worth of your kingdom? Would you help me to see the value of following Jesus? Would you help me to see what's at stake here? Ask God to help you understand why this is so important. And He can begin to change your heart. So, what does He say? Well, let's see. Before we do, though, I'd like to pray and ask God to help us to understand. Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you so much that you inspired Mark to write this account of Jesus' life. Father, I thank you for Jesus' teaching, and I'm just so thankful that we have it in written form. I'm so thankful that we live in a day where we have study Bibles and we have these amazing English translations that we can know you better. And so my prayer is this morning that you would help us to understand you clearly. And Father, I am asking you to please get me out of the way. And will you speak directly and powerfully and clearly through your word to each and every one of us this morning. And it's in your Son's name that we come to you. Amen. Mark chapter 9, let me begin in verse 30. Then they departed from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know it. Remember, Jesus is focusing now on the disciples. For he taught his disciples and said to them, this is verse 31, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And after he is killed, he will rise the third day. But they did not understand this saying and were afraid to ask him. Sounds similar to what we've been reading the last few weeks, doesn't it? So what is the first test of commitment? What is the first question? It's this: is following Jesus worth rethinking his call? Rethinking his call to obedience. Here's the point. If hearing and understanding Jesus means that we realize that his pathway of obedience, his call to discipleship, if we realize it's different than we originally thought, if we realize it's actually far more challenging than we originally anticipated, or if we even realize it's indiscernible, it's unknowable, is it still worth following him? My question is, if it's tough, if it's different than you originally thought, are you still in? Are you still trusting Jesus? So Jesus in verse 31 says this. He's teaching his disciples about his suffering, right? And he says he's being betrayed, he's going to be killed, he's going to rise again. And verse 32 tells us his disciples didn't understand, but they were afraid to ask. And why didn't they understand? They didn't understand because they were looking for a military and a political leader, and he didn't fit their paradigm. He didn't fit what they thought was going to happen. In their minds, a military political leader who's beginning a new kingdom, who's going to overthrow Rome, that dude's not going to die, right? That doesn't fit. It didn't match what they were expecting. So the paradigm of what it meant to be following Jesus was being challenged because they thought they were in the inner group of the new emperor, of the new king. And they couldn't wait. When he took his throne, what does that mean for the first 12, right? What kind of power and fame and authority are they going to enjoy when he takes over? Well, what about us? Did you understand Jesus' call to obedience and to follow him? But now, as you start to read his word, as you're getting to know him better, as you're starting to understand his expectations more, are you starting to realize, wait a minute, this is different than I thought. The cost is more than I expected. Are you willing to say, it's different, but I still trust you, Jesus? Are you willing to say, this is more challenging than I ever imagined, but I'm holding your hand and I'm trusting that you're going to lovingly lead me through this? Are you willing to say, I can't see the path. I don't know what's next, but I'm willing to trust that you see the path and you know what's next, and I'm going to hang on to you, Jesus, as you take me through this. Is it worth it to you? But let's zero in a little bit more. Notice what Jesus says in verse 31. He taught his disciples and said to them, the Son of Man is being betrayed. So what is he talking about here? Is he talking about Judas? Well, I think partially. That's the obvious answer, right? Judas betrayed him. But that's not the whole story of what Jesus is saying here. Who betrayed Jesus, and what did that look like? Well, depending on what English Bible you have in front of you, you may see that translated as delivered up, that Jesus is delivered up, or Jesus is handed over. All three of those English translations are accurate. Those are good. Jesus is betrayed. He is delivered up. He is handed over. They all express what's going on here. But who's doing the delivering up? Who's doing the handing over? Is it Judas? Yes. Was it Pilate? Yes. Was it the religious leaders, the Sanhedrin, the elders, the chief priests, the Pharisees, the Sadducees? Yes. Was it the Roman soldiers? Yes. Was it the crowd that shouted, "Crucify him"? Yes. It was all of them. But there's another character in this story, isn't there? There's another character that's part of all of it. And there's actually a character that's at work all the way back here in verse 31. I don't know if Judas was already scheming at this point. I don't know. But I do know someone who was already preparing Jesus to go to the cross and had been preparing from eternity past. Peter preached a message after Jesus was crucified and after he rose again. Peter preached this powerful message in Jerusalem. And in Acts chapter 2, verse 23, he says this, him, talking about Jesus, being delivered up. It's that same wording. Jesus being delivered up by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God. That's God the Father. You have taken by lawless hands, crucified, and put to death. So yes, the crowds, yes, the Roman soldiers, yes, all of those parties were involved. But God had already determined, and his foreknowledge of this, he had planned, he had ordained that Jesus would go to the cross. There are all kinds of ramifications in our own lives for that doctrinal truth right there. The weight of that. Think about that. What that says about God's love. That God loved sinners so much that he was willing to plan, my own son is going to die in their place. See, Jesus didn't just die for the sinners that were around him, the 12 disciples. We could say, I could say, I delivered him up. I handed him over because he died for my sin too. And he died for your sin. So we're part of it. But God loved you and me so much, he was willing to plan. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because this is a paradigm shift for us. Because if we think that God said, no, Jesus to go through that suffering, that is good and that is right, we wrestle with, well, how can we understand that level of love? How can we understand that level of justice, that level of wrath? That's beyond our understanding. But if God loved Jesus so much that he was willing to send him through that pain, does that put the pain that I might be experiencing in my life in a new light? It absolutely does. The truth that God determined, his foreknowledge was that Jesus would go to the cross and lay down his life. That should overwhelm us with God's love. It should absolutely amaze us at the lengths that God would go to demonstrate his love and his justice and his holiness and his righteousness. It should convict us that Jesus was willing to obey and to submit and to surrender to his Father's will. That Jesus' love was for his Father, first of all, was so great, but also that his love for us was so great that he would be willing to take that path. That the way to the cross, he was willing to walk that path for you and me. And so is it tough for us to understand God's plan? Yes. Can we fully understand God's holiness and his justice, his love and his wrath? No. I don't think that we can fully understand it. But are we willing, when our understanding is limited? Are we willing, when our understanding is challenged, are we willing to still trust Jesus and to say, I'm willing to follow you even if I don't fully understand your plan? That's what Jesus was asking of his disciples. Even if it doesn't all make sense, even if we can't wrap our minds around it, we need to trust, we need to have faith. Well, what does he say next? Let's look at verse 33. Then he came to Capernaum. This is Jesus with the disciples. And when he was in the house, he asked them, what was it you disputed among yourselves on the road? Do you think Jesus knew? Of course he did. He's teaching them. But they kept silent. For on the road, this is verse 34, they kept silent, for on the road they had disputed. They'd argued among themselves who would be the greatest. And he sat down. That's taking the posture of a teacher in that culture. He sits down so he can teach them an important lesson. And he calls the 12 and he says to them, if anyone desires to be first, he shall be the last of all and servant of all. So test number two is following Jesus worth being last? If anyone desires to be the first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. The disciples are talking, they're walking along the road, and they're arguing about who's going to be the greatest. And Jesus knew what they were doing. He needs to teach them a lesson. And they don't answer, right? In verse 34, they won't answer because they're embarrassed. They're ashamed. They're convicted. They know they were doing wrong. What's amazing about this in verse 34, they had disputed among themselves who would be greatest. Luke actually tells us in chapter 22 of Luke, last week we read the passage, as we were meeting at the Lord's table, we read the passage of the Last Supper when Jesus was teaching his disciples and sharing with them, this is what's coming. We have the bread, we have the cup. Luke tells us in Luke 22, at the Last Supper, the disciples were still arguing about who was the greatest. They still hadn't learned. And lest we get too judgmental, we haven't either, okay? That's what's coming. You know me. See, in Jewish culture, rank, status was so important to them. And you can see it in the way that they interacted. But in 2,000 years, we haven't changed one bit. We love ranking everything. And right now, because of algorithms and how everything works, ratings are everything. I mean, you can buy a sandwich, you can get an oil change, anything. They'll tell you, if you give me a 5-star, it'll really help me out, right? Ratings are everything. And we've even renamed a word. This word goat used to refer to some animal that chews stuff and likes climbing on playgrounds, ironically, right? But now what does it mean? Greatest of all time. And we love arguing about it. You pick your sport, right? No, it's LeBron. No, it's Michael. No, it's Wilt. No, it's Kareem, or whatever sport you want to pick. We love ranking everybody. We're no different than the disciples, are we? And Jesus is saying, no. In my kingdom, you need to take that ranking and you need to turn it on its head. He's saying, in my kingdom, the first is going to be last. Remember, we've already studied, if you want to live, you got to die. If you want to save your life, you've got to lose it. If you want to be great, you need to be willing to suffer. God's kingdom turns it around. And so let me ask the question again, what's it worth to you? What is following Jesus worth to you? Is following Jesus worth giving up our culture's love affair with ranking and status and fame? Is it worth following Jesus even if you are never recognized? Even if you are never acknowledged? Even if you are never lauded? Even if you are never praised? Even if no one ever knows except God? Is it worth following him? Because the heart of the question is this: are we in it to be recognized, or are we in it for God's glory? And that's what it comes down to, doesn't it? Well, this second question and the third question are tied together. They're similar, but I wanted to differentiate because Jesus, he works on some nuance here that I think is helpful. So, is following Jesus worth rethinking Jesus' call? Is following Jesus worth being last? Well, let's see what he says. I'm going to begin again in verse 35, and we'll look at the third question. And he sat down, and he called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone desires to be first, he shall be the last of all and servant of all. Then he took a little child, and he set him in the midst of them. And when he had taken him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one of these little children in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not only me, is what he's saying, but him who sent me. Now John answered him, saying, Teacher, we saw someone who does not follow us casting out demons in your name. And we forbade him, we stopped him, because he doesn't follow us. But Jesus said, do not forbid it. For no one who works a miracle in my name can soon afterwards speak evil of me. For he who is not against us is on our side. For whoever gives you a cup of water to drink in my name because you belong to Christ, assuredly, I say to you, he will by no means lose his reward. That's a great encouragement, verse 41. Then he continues, verse 42. But whoever causes one of these little ones, the child that Jesus has with him, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and if he were thrown into the sea. Wow. The question here that I want us to wrestle with is following Jesus worth serving others? So this is tied with being last, serving others, but there's some nuance here. Jesus, he keeps on teaching this idea that the greatest and least, that the disciples needed to wrestle with this. And he brings in a child to illustrate his point. And the child, though, here represents any believer. And he says that in verse 42. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me. So the child is representing a believer. And he can represent someone who's marginalized. We have that word in our culture now. Someone who's overlooked in society. And Jesus teaches in verse 37, he says, anyone who receives this child, they're also receiving or they're demonstrating love to Jesus. And he says, not only are you receiving or demonstrating love to Jesus, if you receive that child, you're actually receiving God the Father. There's a two-step process there. And he says in verse 41, if you do this, if you're serving others, if you're loving others, then you're not going to lose that reward. There's great promise and encouragement here with this. But John speaks up in verse 38, and it seems like he's speaking out of conviction. He's understanding a little of what Jesus is saying, of serving others. And he says, well, there's this guy, he's casting out demons in your name, and we stopped him because he's not one of us. He's not one of the 12. Was that the right thing? Should we have received him? Should we have accepted that? And what does Jesus say? Verse 39. He says, don't stop him. Don't stop him. He says, listen, there's going to be different groups. There are going to be different bands of followers. And you need to not worry about criticizing and trying to stop other people who are trying to follow me. You follow me. You obey me. You worry about yourself. Stop criticizing others that are trying to follow. What's so amazing about this is this. We just saw the disciples were trying to cast out demons and they couldn't, right? But this other guy can. It's not too far for my imagination that there's probably some jealousy going on here. And Jesus sees right through it and says, you need to be willing to serve. You don't worry about other people. You serve. His point is one of humility. He says, don't desire to be first. Don't desire to be the greatest. Don't be desired to be recognized for how awesome you are at serving me. Instead, serve others. Notice and care for the youngest. Notice and care for the most vulnerable. Notice and care for the marginalized, the aged, the overlooked. And I'd like to just take a moment right now and pause and encourage you. Because I know that there are so many here that you are doing this. Some of you have actually given your lives to care for children. Some of you right now are sacrificing and you're caring for the elderly. Some of you are investing hours and hours and hours seeking to encourage people. You're visiting people, you're writing cards, you're making phone calls. You know that this is true, that Jesus tells us to love others, to notice the overlooked, and to communicate love and compassion, God's love and compassion to them. And you're doing that. And I want you to see verse 41. Jesus says, you will by no means lose your reward if you do this service in Jesus' name. If you do it for his glory and for his honor, not worrying about whether you're being recognized or not, whether anyone ever notices. You're just serving for his glory and his honor. The problem is this. We still live in bodies, physical bodies, with remaining sinful habits and even sinful tendencies. And because of that, many, I would say most, perhaps all of us, still struggle with seeds of pride in our lives. And that pride will draw us to want to be noticed. It draws us to want to be recognized. And when we're overlooked in our serving, we get frustrated. We want someone to thank us. We want someone to realize how great we are at serving. Even in saying those words out loud, it sounds crazy, doesn't it? But I'm suspicious that all of us have been guilty of that at times. One commentator said this: pride is the opposite of wanting to serve. It's the opposite of wanting to be last. And he said this: the danger revealed here is that pride ruins unity by destroying relationships. Relationships are based on loving sacrifice and service, on selfless deferring to and giving to others. Pride, being self-focused, is indifferent to others. Beyond that, it is ultimately judgmental and critical. It's what John was exhibiting in verse 38. And therefore, it's divisive. Because of that, pride is the most common destroyer both of relationships and churches. Wow, what a warning here for all of us, isn't it? If we don't address this pride in our lives, we're in danger. And then Jesus, in verse 42, he gives a specific illustration. He says, whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me. So he's saying, listen, don't, in your efforts at serving me, do not cause a believer to stumble. A younger believer, a more immature believer than you, you need to be aware of your behavior. You need to be aware of how you're going about trying to serve me, because your testimony, your behavior matters. Do not cause another believer to fall into sin. Do not. And Jesus, he's so serious about this. Look at the illustration he uses. He says, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. Now, there's two different kinds of millstones in the Bible. There's small millstones that a person would use with their hand to grind the grain, and there's some amazing stories about those millstones in the Bible that I love. But that's not this millstone. This millstone is the big kind that you would typically attach to a donkey or an ox or long-haired guys named Samson. They were the only ones that could move this thing, all right? And there's some random millstone in Jerusalem we walked by, and I went, oh, and I love that there's a station wagon right next to it because it gives the context of the how big that thing is. Okay, and of course, when you're traveling with teens, you're going to have people that love to photobomb it. So Lydia's beautiful face is in the middle of my millstone. She was a senior on that trip. Jesus' point here is very clear. He's talking about how serious he is about sin. And I'm emphasizing this because I think today it's fair for me to say we tend to minimize sin. We tend to, well, it's not that big of a deal. But Jesus is saying, if you are sinning, you're causing someone else to sin. If you cause someone else to sin, it'd be better for you than having a millstone tied around your neck. You'd be better off dead. Because I don't care if you're a lifeguard. I don't care if you're a lifeguard at Legoland. If you've got this thing tied around your neck, you're not coming back up. Okay? You've got an appointment with Davy Jones. That's it. You're not getting out of this. And Jesus is saying, that's how serious I am about you causing someone else to sin. Now, you may be asking, okay, well, Pastor Dave, what does that mean? How might I cause another believer to sin? Well, again, a pastor, he gave 4 suggestions here. And if you are in a faith group, we'll talk about this more this evening in our faith groups. How might we be causing others to sin? Well, one is by direct temptation. Do you remember Abram? He said to his wife Sarai, why don't you just say that you're my sister? That's a direct temptation to sin. That's an illicit solution. That's lying. I know it was a partial truth. I know that story. But it was a sin, and we know that it was a sin. And that's an example of believers should never do that. Directly encourage another believer to sin by offering a solution that is completely ungodly, it's unholy. But another way that we can sin is by indirect temptation, and that is this. In Ephesians 6:4, fathers are instructed to not what? Not provoke their children to wrath, right? And so a father, in the way that they're going about their life, if they are parenting in such a way that there's a lack of kindness, there's a lack of attentiveness, there's a lack of humility or forgiveness, or even in an overbearing expectations. Now, the father is responsible for his own sin, and the child is responsible for their sin. If a child responds sinfully, God will hold the child accountable for their sin. That principle is clear throughout the Bible, from the Old Testament. Yet, moms and dads can make it tougher on their kids and provide an atmosphere where they're leading those kids into sin, can't they? Boy, that's tough. That's indirect temptation. Another way is by setting a bad example. And Pastor Greg addressed this when he preached on liberty. Romans 14 addresses this. Mature believers may be saying, well, this is not a sin and it's fine for me to do it. And they go ahead and do that, but there's a weaker believer watching. And the weaker believer doesn't understand. And in the weaker believer's mind, that is wrong and it is a sin. And the stronger believer then leads the weaker believer into a sin. And Jesus is saying, no. Do not cause another one to stumble. And then lastly, consider Hebrews 10:24. That we may spur one another on to love and to good deeds. If we are failing to spur, to cause, to encourage other believers to do good, we could be guilty of causing others to sin. Well, that's challenging, isn't it? The expectations are high. So my question is this: what is following Jesus worth to you? Is it worth serving others? Is it worth setting aside pride? Setting aside your desire to be noticed? Is it worth being willing to serve others, even if you are never congratulated, never recognized? Even if no one ever notices? What I want to tell you and remind you is God always notices, and God will reward you for your service. Is it worth it? The answer is yes. You will not lose your reward, verse 41. But then he keeps going. Look at verse 43. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter into life maimed rather than having two hands to go to hell, into the fire that shall never be quenched, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. And if your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame rather than to have 2 feet, to be cast into hell, into the fire that shall never be quenched, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with one eye rather than having 2 eyes, to be cast into hell fire, where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. So if you can imagine, it's already been challenging. Jesus is already challenging his disciples, and now it's as if he reaches up to the dial on the oven and he cranks it up a few more degrees, doesn't he? I see these verses as some of the most challenging verses that Jesus speaks, some of his most challenging calls to discipleship. And what he's saying here is this: is following Jesus worth amputating sin in your life? Now, let me be clear. I believe in the literal interpretation of God's word. However, Jesus speaks in hyperbole at times. That means he's intentionally overstating things. So I want all of us to be clear on this. There are religions, I think we know, there are religions today that have things like this in their religious books, and they actually still do amputate hands. Jesus is not saying to cut your hand off if you have stolen recently, because the issue is not actually your hand. We read this in James. The issue is your heart, right? Sin, your hand doesn't cause you to sin. Sin comes out of the lustful desires that are in your heart. What Jesus is saying is this. He's making a strong point to say, no, you need to be willing to deal radically with the sin that's in your life. His point is, it's better to enter into his kingdom. It's better to enter into heaven without a hand or without an eye or without a foot, losing something that's incredibly valuable to you. It's better to lose something that we would consider highly valuable than to spend eternity in hell. He's saying making it to heaven is worth extraordinary loss on earth. One commentary said this way: take decisive, prompt action against whatever would draw your allegiance away from Christ. And Jesus is graphically clear here about the terrible nature of hell. He's quoting Isaiah 66:24 when he says, the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. Now, in the time of Jesus, when he's speaking, there's a valley outside of Jerusalem. And in that valley, see that, I'm going to try to say this quickly, and I'm going to speak over it a little bit because we have a mixed group with lots of different ages in the room. I'm going to say it that way. That valley is where in the Old Testament terrible, terrible sacrifices were offered, okay? And so Josiah, a righteous king, he decided to turn that valley into a trash heap so those kinds of awful sacrifices wouldn't happen anymore. But when Josiah then did that, that valley became a place of ongoing fire. They would just take the trash out there, and it would constantly be burning, and then there's worms and maggots that are always eating the trash. It's smelly, it's awful, it's nasty, it's terrible. And Jesus uses that graphic image that his disciples, all of his hearers would have known. He uses that image to illustrate that's what hell is like. It's awful. We don't wish this. I don't wish this on anyone. And there's a popular doctrine today, theology answer today. It's being written about that hell just burns up. It doesn't go on forever. But that's not true, because that's not what Jesus teaches. Jesus is using language here. He says, the fire is not quenched. The worm does not die. Hell is awful, and it's eternal. It's very serious. And so let me ask you this question. Where do you think you will be in 20 years? Now, that's going to be a different answer for all over in the room, right? Some of you are like, I hope I'm out of school. Some of you, I hope I'm retired. 20 years, I don't know. What do you think in 20 years? But but let me ask this then. Where do you think that you'll be in 200 years? I don't think there's going to be, I know we're making advances with technology today, but no one in here is going to be in here in 200 years. I hope. In 200 years, every single one of us is going to be in one of two places. There are only two possibilities. Our souls are eternal. We will either be enjoying the riches and the glories of God's kingdom in heaven, worshiping Jesus, worshiping God the Father with Jesus. We will be enjoying that. Or we're going to be being eaten eternally by worms where the fire does not go out. It's awful. It's terrible. There's only two possibilities. And Jesus doesn't skirt around this. He teaches it directly. And the question is this. Jesus says, the cost of not being willing to give up your sin now, is it worth eternity in hell? No, it's not. And so how about you? Are you willing to radically abandon your sin? To cut it off no matter the cost, like losing a hand, like gouging out an eye? Are you worth saying, I will not go back. I need Jesus. I want Jesus in my life. Are you willing to confess that sin and give it to Jesus? Cry out to him and ask him to forgive you. And then we close with these last two verses. For everyone will be seasoned with fire, and every sacrifice will be seasoned with salt. I'm reading verse 49. Salt is good, but if the salt loses its flavor, how will you season it? Have salt in yourselves and have peace with one another. These verses, especially verse 49, are difficult. And if you studied ahead and they stumped you, don't be discouraged, please. Let me share what I believe Jesus is saying here. He starts verse 49 by saying the word for, which ties this to what he was saying before. He says, for everyone. So what I believe he's saying here is this. He's saying everyone, believers and unbelievers, they're going to be tested with fire. They'll be seasoned by salt, which salt has this enduring and this preserving these characteristics. And so what I believe he's saying here is this. Unbelievers are going to be tested by fire in eternity. It's going to endure, and it's awful. But believers, they're going to be tested by fire, this purifying fire in this life. And we see that in 1 Peter. That God uses fire to refine us. And then in verse 50, Jesus says, salt is good. But if the salt loses its flavor, how will you season it? Have salt in yourselves. What he's saying to the disciples is he's saying, you be salty, you be savory. As you follow me, endure the testing that I bring, endure the purifying that I bring, but maintain your allegiance to me. Impact your culture around you for me. Endure. And I love that he closes with, have peace with one another. So he takes them all the way back to verse 34. Like, stop fighting. Stop arguing about who's the greatest. Have peace with one another. Stop being jealous. Stop wanting to be noticed. Stop caring if someone else sees your good deeds. You serve the little ones. You care for believers. You deal radically with the sin that's in your life, whether it's pride or jealousy or whatever it is. And so here's my final question for us. What's it worth to you? What's it worth to you? Is following Jesus worth the purifying tests of fire that will come? And I know that some of you are in purifying tests right now. Will you commit to obeying Jesus no matter what? Will you believe? Will you know? Will you have faith that he does love you? He is leading you. He's good and he's right. Will you follow Jesus even through the salty seasoning that he brings into your life to preserve you and make your life a truly savory offering to God? And I'd also like to just ask this. If you're here this morning and you realized, I don't know if I have a place in heaven. I don't know where I'm going to be in 200 years. Then my call to you, my plea to you this morning is, don't leave our gathering without getting that right. I would love to talk with you. Pastor Greg would love to talk with you about what it means to know that you're forgiven, to know those songs that we sang earlier, they're true, that Jesus' love was shown in his shed blood for you, that it can wash you clean, that you can be free from that sin if you'll cry out and ask him to save you. I'm going to pray. I'm going to close in prayer, and then we're going to sing a final song. This song is a new song for us. I love this song. This song is going to challenge us to consider who Christ is during the trials, during the seasons of doubt, that Christ is our sure and steady anchor. And so I want to encourage you, if you are wrestling with these tests of commitment, God, am I really in? Sing this as a praise to God. Yes, I am in. Sing this as a song of commitment that we will trust God. If, as we're singing, you would like someone to pray with you, we will have a room open over to my right, and we would love to pray with you for any needs that you have. If God is calling you to respond, that you need to commit to him in a new way, Pastor Greg is going to be down to my right, and I'm going to go down to my left. We would love to pray with you. We'd love to talk with you, answer any questions that you may have. Father, we thank you for your word. Thank you for this clear call. Will you now please help us to respond in obedience? And it's in your Son's name we come to you. Amen.